justice.
And Kenda must figure out why.
Whatever happened started right here.
Drop the keys out the window. Do it now.
You're being handled here at gunpoint.
Back up the car.
Don't do something stupid.
Then, a church of God turns into a house of horrors.
I am the Lord Jesus Christ.
They were praying for their lives.
He has an inherent violence about him.
Don't touch the knife, Richard.
He's not complying. He's just kind of staring right through us.
Don't do it, Richard!
In my business, you become a very light sleeper. I had a lot of people wanted to kill me, among other things. If I would hear any noise, I was awake. I was not just awake, I was wide awake. This is the way our life was. It was from one event to the next.
It's the middle of the night. Larry and Kelly Schlott are asleep. When all of a sudden,
Larry, what's that?
Sounds like someone at the front door.
Who the hell could it be at this hour of the night?
I don't know. I'll go check it out. Stay here.
Larry, what are you doing?
Larry picks up a baseball bat. He's ready to use it if he has to.
Louise?
But he's shocked when he opens the door. His neighbor Louise is crying and frantic.
It's Peter, he's been shot. I don't have a weapon, I need you to help me.
She knew that Larry knew CPR, so she asked him to come render aid to Pete.
Oh my God. Pete! Pete! Pete!
Obviously has serious injuries.
Oh God.
Hold on, Pete. You with me, buddy?
Larry knows it's not working. It's not going to be able to save him.
A few miles north, Sergeant Joe Kenda is struggling with his own personal battle.
I don't sleep well. And I would often slip out the front door and be on my front porch and smoke a cigarette and think about all the things I've done and all the things I've seen and cannot unsee. And now here we go again.
Within the hour, Kenda arrives on scene and meets with Detective Skip Arms.
At that time in 1986, I was a detective sergeant in homicide, meaning I'm a supervisor. I'm responsible for a call team of 3 detectives that worked for me. But I had a standby call team. I could get as many as 6 people and can expand as necessary. If I needed 12 people or 18 people, I could get them. But we'd start with 3. So as a sergeant, I would call each one of those guys in their home and wake them up, give them an address and say, we have a shooting and apparently he's not going to survive. See you there.
Hey, Skip.
Good evening, Joe.
When I arrived on scene, there was very little activity going on. There was no traffic in the streets. It was really very quiet.
This particular scene, by the time we get there, it's like 3:15 in the morning, and the area is dead. Everybody's asleep, the excitement's over, the ambulance has left, there's no sirens running, so there's no witnesses, there's not even any press. It's uniquely quiet, which was pleasant for me. You didn't have to deal with a circus when you get there. There was no circus. So we talked to a patrol officer and said, can you tell us what you know about this shooting?
So what we got?
We've got one shooting victim, shot multiple times. He left here in the ambulance alive, but we're not sure what his status is now.
You got an ID?
Yes.
The officer says that the victim is a 35-year-old male whose name is Peter Martinez. He was shot in the front yard of his own home.
Any witnesses?
Martinez's wife and kids were in the house at the time of the shooting, but they've gone to the hospital with him in the ambulance. That's about it.
They've already awakened several of their direct neighbors, all of whom say they didn't see anything. So the only thing left for us there is the crime scene itself. You can learn a lot from a crime scene if you listen and pay attention. The crime scene will speak to you. It will whisper, but it will speak to you.
The victim was lying here when the medical arrived.
What's that? Looks like a crescent wrench.
Let's make sure we have that dusted for prints. It would appear that the crescent wrench would have some role in this situation. It potentially could have either been an offensive or a defensive weapon.
We also got some casings over here. How many? 5 total. 25 caliber.
We also found slugs in the yard, too.
The front yard appeared to be trampled down, so that indicated that perhaps there was some kind of struggle that may have occurred on the yard and then moved into the street.
Whatever happened started right here.
My experience tells me there's a confrontation. Words get exchanged, threats are made, things get out of hand, and it ends with gunfire.
Which hospital was the victim transported to?
St. Francis.
Okay, Skip, I'll meet you there. Works for me.
So for now, we've learned all we can here. We need to respond to the hospital where our victim is to determine A, his condition, and more importantly, B, because that's where we believe we're going to find our witnesses.
Mr. Martinez was shot 5 times in all. Once in the shoulder, chest, stomach, and twice in the arm. He's in surgery now, but it looks doubtful. You know, another thing that you should probably be aware of is that the medics said they found him in his boxer shorts when they first picked him up.
Really?
The odds are he was either getting ready for bed or was already in bed. And when he was awakened by something, he came out in his underwear, and whatever happened next resulted in 5 holes in him that he didn't have a little while earlier.
Was his family around?
His wife and children in the lobby.
Yeah, thanks, Doc.
So we encounter first the wife of the victim, Louise, and she has 2 sons that are with her, Peter Jr. and Eric.
Excuse me. I'm Sergeant Kenda, and this is Detective Irons.
I'm Louise.
Do you think we could talk to you for a minute with you and your sons?
Well, I'd prefer if they had a little more time, but I can talk to you.
They're worried about their father. No point in even attempting a conversation with them.
Could you tell us a little bit about your relationship with your husband?
Well, we aren't technically married, but Peter and I have been together for over 15 years.
And everything was good between you guys?
Yeah, we had a good relationship. We actually work together, so we argue sometimes, but nothing serious.
Peter and Louise are both custodians at a building downtown. Doesn't pay a lot of money and it's hard work, but they get to work together and they enjoy that. And it's something that Louise really is happy about, that she gets to spend her days working with the love of her life.
So what exactly happened last evening?
Well, Peter and I were working and we got home around 10:30.
They went in to check on their boys, and they then made their way to bed.
I'm exhausted. What do I have going on tomorrow, babe?
Eric's got baseball in the afternoon, and I'm meeting Lucy for lunch.
All right, well, I think I'm just gonna go get some stuff for this weekend.
Wake up, Peter!
Who the hell's that?
Oh, man.
He goes and opens the door,
Peter!
and it's his sister, Karen Michaels,
What's up, brother? You gonna let me in or what?
and her friend Lucia, and they are both extremely intoxicated.
Hey, Louise! Let's have a drink.
They had been at a party, and they came over there to keep the party underway.
Peter and his sister get along?
Sort of. I mean, Karen can be a real pain in the ass.
He was really sometimes super annoyed with her because of her manners and why she lived her life the way she did, of which he did not approve. He thought she drank too much and too often, and so on. So there's always this back and forth between he and his sister, and now his sister's at his front door.
A sibling dynamic is very complicated because, especially when it's an older brother and a younger sister, a lot of times the older brother wants to take care of the younger sister, wants to help her out and everything. But after a while, you can say, hey, wait a minute, here I am, working hard and everything. You can't hold a job. It's almost like you want to do tough love in a way, but yet you don't want to give up on them. You always want to be there to help them if you can. But then it's like, well, am I enabling this to happen? Is she like this because I'm always here to bail her out if she needs me?
At first, Peter was annoyed, but after a while, he started to loosen up and relax.
I don't know what either one of you are talking about.
I remember the old days.
No, you don't.
And they opened some beers, and they turn on some music, and they're talking, and they're actually enjoying themselves.
I hope they do another block party.
Yeah, I gotta take a leak. I'll be back.
Everything seemed to be going well.
What's that song?
You can change it if you want. The stereo's in Junior's room. Just try to be quiet. He's sleeping. You want another?
Yeah. You know me.
But all of a sudden, something happened.
And Louise heard some type of a commotion in Peter Jr.'s room.
Come on, Lucia, let's go.
Wait, why?
I said, come on, let's get the hell out of here.
What happened? Karen, what's wrong?
Let's get your husband.
Louise asked Peter what happened, and his response was, "Oh, that's just Karen. Good riddance. I'm glad she's gone." They then went to bed.
Not 30 minutes after we laid down, we heard people shouting outside.
Damn it, Karen!
Louise looks out the window. She sees two cars, a red car and a gray car. And there's a bunch of people out there, and she doesn't know who these people are.
What were they saying?
I don't know, but they sounded upset.
So Louise is going to call 911 to report this problem.
911, what's your emergency?
But before she can say a word,
Hi, there's... So I dropped the phone and I ran outside. The red car was gone and the gray one was pulling away. And Peter was just lying there in the street, all alone.
Do you think Karen could have shot Peter?
I don't think so. I mean, it's her own brother.
Okay, you said you saw a gray car. Do you know what type of car it was?
Yeah, I think so.
Having this information at hand, it's important for us to try to find the gray car,
Sergeant Kenda, dispatch.
and the occupants of the car.
How do you put on APB?
so we offer the description of the suspect vehicle over the air to all officers, all points bulletin, a suspect vehicle in what probably is a fatal shooting, consider armed and dangerous.
Luckily, it doesn't take long for an officer to spot the vehicle in question.
31 to dispatch.
Dispatch to 31.
Got eyes on that possible suspect vehicle. Go ahead and send me back up 2000 block of Corona Street.
We basically call it a felony traffic stop.
Driver, turn off the car and drop the keys out the window.
They fear that the occupants are potentially involved in a serious violent felony crime.
Do it now.
So the driver was directed to exit first.
Driver, step out, slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them.
He was a tall, black male, which didn't fit the descriptions.
Back up to the sound of my voice. Do it now.
Passenger, step out of the car. Do it now.
When the passenger steps out of the car,
Hands on your head.
she is Karen Michaels, sister of the victim. How convenient. So now we do have the right car, and we certainly have the right people. Now this situation has become dangerous. We're investigating the shooting of a father of two children, Peter Martinez. And patrol officers have just stopped a car that was seen fleeing from the scene,
Driver, step out, slowly.
containing an occupant that was involved in a disturbance with the victim.
On your knees.
You're being handled here at gunpoint. Don't do something stupid.
Don't move.
Because of the short time frame between the shooting and the contact of this vehicle,
All right, stand up.
the chances were very high the occupants were involved in the crime.
Put your hands behind your back. Do it now.
So they had to be treated as potentially violent felony suspects.
It's clear. Clear.
So the two occupants were driven to the Detective Bureau. And once there, they were placed in separate rooms.
So what do you want to do?
Why don't you take Karen and I'll talk to this guy?
Works for me.
This individual identifies himself as Hank Michaels, and he is Karen Michaels' husband. and they have this car registered in both of their names.
Is someone gonna finally tell me what the hell is going on?
I was actually hoping that you'd be the one to do that.
We know Karen left the house upset. Did she go home and tell her husband that she had this fight with her brother? And did he come back over to the house in his gray car to avenge his wife?
How'd you end up going for a drive with your wife so early in the morning?
Man, I was sleeping. And Karen came home all worked up.
He says his wife woke him up when she came home. She said she got in a terrible fight with her brother, and she wants him to drive her to her mother's house.
And you didn't ask what went on between her and Peter?
No, they're always arguing about something. And besides, Karen was drunk, and I did not want to get her going. So I just drove her to her mother's house.
And as they were in the act of doing that, they're stopped by the police, and they got guns pointed at him, and he doesn't know what's going on.
So you never went to Peter's house at all?
No, not at all.
So there's Hank's story. Is that believable? Well, maybe it is. Think back to Louise. Louise says she sees Karen with some people. If this guy is there to defend his wife, he's the one knocking on the door.
So we try to find a record for Hank. He doesn't have a record. He's clean. At face value, there's no reason to believe he's being deceptive to us. So now our next step is to want to talk with Karen and see where that takes us.
Wake up, Miss Michaels.
What the hell are you doing?
I want to talk to you about your brother.
Which brother?
Karen Michaels is beyond drunk. She's loaded, and she couldn't hit the ground with her hat.
Your brother Peter? Peter Martinez?
What about him?
He was shot 5 times. Do you happen to know who did that to him?
I ain't talking until I get a lawyer.
Well, you're drunk, Karen, but you know enough to keep your mouth shut when you're in a jam. And guess what, baby cakes? You are in a jam.
All right. Well, we're still going to hold you for the time being.
Whatever.
So have we gotten very far? No. We have her, which is useful, but she has nothing to say to us. So now we need another pathway to find out who we're looking at.
So we felt that with some time passing, we would want to circle back and see if either Louise knew anything new or if by this point, either of her sons were willing to talk.
Have you received any word on your husband?
He went in for another surgery, so we're just here to get something to eat before heading back.
We were wondering if either one of your sons might be able to talk to us.
I really don't think Eric is, but Junior could probably talk to you. Junior, come here for a minute.
Eric was only 11 years old when this occurred, and so it's understandable that at that age, going through such a traumatic event with your father, you're going to be very distraught, very upset, very emotional.
Peter Jr. is in high school. We think he's our best shot because he's a little older and maybe a little less emotional.
Want to have a seat?
And maybe a little more honest.
Junior, did you happen to see any of what happened to your father last night?
Yeah.
Can you tell us what happened?
I was sleeping in my bedroom when my Aunt Karen woke me up. Aunt Karen, what's going on?
How do you work this thing?
They had long lengths of speaker wire coming from the stereo in the son's bedroom to the speakers in the living room area. Peter Jr. says she must have changed the music, that she can't make this thing operate.
Aunt Karen! Karen, what the hell are you doing in here? Damn it, Karen, don't be disrespecting my house. Just look at my son.
The your radio's crap.
Karen, get the hell out of my son's room now.
Oh, shut up. What you gonna do?
He slaps her open hand in the face hard.
You're always walking around here drunk asking me for money. You don't respect no one. Get out of here.
Go to hell, Peter.
She stormed out of the room, and my dad told me to go back to sleep. But a little while later, something woke me up again.
Wake up, Peter!
He was awakened, so he gets up in a haze. Looks out the window, he sees his aunt, Karen Michaels. Her children are with her.
Karen, what are you doing?
And they are in an argument.
Did you see what happened?
Well, I ran outside and tried to help. Dad, what's going on? Off my property. Dad, Junior, go get my gun.
And the kid says, I didn't know what he meant because we don't have a gun. I guess he was trying to bluff him.
Hey, calm down. Calm down.
I went back inside because I thought it was over, but it wasn't.
Peter Jr. says
Oh my God, Dad!
he heard several gunshots.
As the gray car drove away, Peter Jr. tells us that he was able to see the person that was in the passenger seat, and that is most likely our shooter. This is the break we need.
Did you recognize him?
Yes, I know who it is.
This whole search process in this investigation has to be to find a good witness, and we have just discovered a star witness. Now, who might this shooter be? We're investigating the shooting of Peter Martinez, who was gunned down in front of his own home.
Oh my God, Dad!
We've now learned that his son, Peter Jr., got a good look at the shooter.
So what's the guy's name?
Jake Ferguson.
So Jake is our dude. It isn't Karen, and it's certainly not her husband.
Who's Jake Ferguson?
He dates my cousin Nina.
The information that Peter Jr. could give us about Jake is he's a white male. He's about 18 years old or so.
He's only been in town a few weeks, but everybody classifies him as a bully, and everybody knows that Jake always has a gun.
Do you know where we could find this Jake?
I think he's in the army or something.
Thank you for talking to us. Yeah, we'll let ourselves out. Thank you.
Thank you.
So it turns out that Mr. Ferguson is in the United States Army. He is on a federal reservation where we have no jurisdiction. We have to elicit the cooperation of military police authorities to make any physical arrest on Fort Carson. So we contact the MP desk, which operates 24 hours a day on Carson, and we explain that Jake Ferguson is in fact wanted by us for questioning involving an attempted murder at that point, and that they should find him for us and put him in a holding cell at the MP headquarters on Fort Carson. Because when you're in the Army, they own you. You don't have rights. You're under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They can do whatever they want. They don't have to advise you of your right to counsel or anything. It's a whole different system of law. So we drive over to Fort Carson, and we'll find out that Mr. Ferguson is living and working on Fort Carson as a private E1 in the United States Army. So we have to elicit the cooperation of military police authorities, and they snatch up Jake Ferguson in a heartbeat.
Jake, I'm with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Do you know why I'm here?
I think so.
You can just see it in his eyes. It's obvious that he's scared. As someone who interviews and interrogates people, you need to gear your questioning based on what you see in order to be effective.
Am I under arrest?
Not at the moment. But I need to know what happened last night.
Okay. I'll tell you everything.
He didn't hold back. He really needed to get this off his chest.
I was at my girlfriend Nina's house, and we had a few beers, watched a movie, and then I fell asleep on the couch when her brother Rico woke me up.
Jake, come on, get up, man.
What's going on?
Come on, we've got to go.
Where's Nina?
She's already in the car. We got to help my mom. You got your gun?
Yeah, right.
All right, let's go.
The brother Rico tells Jake they're going to go settle a fight between Nina's mom and her brother Peter Martinez.
He sees this as an opportunity to be an enforcer, to go help the family defend their honor, so to speak.
You have to remember who these people are. They are people who live on the margins of society. They're not well paid. They have few, if any, possessions. They are the people society ignores. They're the drones of society that do the work nobody else wants to do. As a result, the only thing they have of value to them is their self-respect. And they will defend that to the death because they have nothing else. They've been kicked to the curb by society all their lives. You can say things to me, you can pay me poorly, you can give me lots of instructions on what I have to do, but don't disrespect me because I won't take that. Not from anybody, not even from blood family. So that's the mentality here.
Who went to Peter's house?
Karen was hammered, so I drove her car. Nina, Rico, and their other sister Marta were in another car.
Peter, come out here. I want to talk to you. You ain't gonna hit our mom.
Get your ass out here, Uncle Peter.
I kind of hung back by the car while they went up to the house to confront Peter.
Come out here.
Peter jerked the door open, already in a rage,
You a big man hitting a woman up?
Off my property.
and is screaming and yelling and using obscenities toward Karen Michaels and her children.
Nigga, learn to control your kids. You don't get to tell me what to do with my kids. I'm gonna kick Peter.
Beat his ass, Mom.
Jake says a scuffle begins, followed by them falling down and rolling around in the dirt in the front yard.
Jake said that Karen actually pulled Peter's pants off, leaving him just in his underwear. And then she started laughing at him.
You care? Touch me again. Hey, do something.
Dad,
Come on.
what's going on?
Hey,
Junior, go get my gun.
Get in. You want me to drive?
So they started heading back to the cars. I go to get in the front, but Karen insisted on driving.
Come on, damn it.
Because Karen was drunk, she was having difficulty getting the car started.
Get the hell out of here. What's wrong with you?
Yo, back up the car.
You need deaf? Are you drunk and stupid?
I said back off the car, old man.
What'd you call me? Think you're tough, white boy?
Jake says that he then sees Peter reach for his waistband and pull out an object he said was long and shiny.
Jake panics and empties that gun into Peter Martinez from a range of 3 or 4 feet. And every bullet he fires hits him.
Oh, damn. Oh, damn. Give me the gun. Give me the gun. It's not like he wasn't asking for it.
Even though she was still pretty intoxicated, the fact that she didn't care whether or not her brother just got shot is pretty callous.
What did Karen do with the gun?
I don't know. I think she has it somewhere in the house.
Well, Jake, I appreciate you being honest with me, but I'm gonna have to place you under arrest. Go ahead and cuff him.
Peter Martinez has been pronounced dead at the hospital. So now it's no longer attempted murder, it's just murder.
After Jake Ferguson's confession, investigators go to the house of Karen Michaels in search of the murder weapon.
We find a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol that's obviously been wiped clean, but ballistics says this is the weapon that fired the shots that killed Peter Martinez.
Jake was charged with second-degree murder. Karen was charged with accessory to second-degree murder. And then the district attorney ultimately made the decision to take this case to a grand jury. And after the case was presented to the grand jury, they came back with a no true bill. When a grand jury comes back with a no true bill, it doesn't mean that somebody didn't commit the offense. It means that that body or grand jury feels that there is insufficient evidence to move the case forward to a trial. So there's a lesser standard, if you will, of proof than a jury would require in a regular trial. So what that means for us is that they felt that it didn't rise to the standard. And in this case, most likely, it was probably the issue of assuming that Jake was defending himself as opposed to being the aggressor.
Meaning that, in their opinion, there's insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Jacob Ferguson engaged in criminal behavior. So Mr. Ferguson was released without charges, and therefore so was Karen Michaels. And the matter was closed.
You know, it's the kind of thing where really there was no justice. No justice for Peter, no justice for his family, because nobody had to be accountable for what happened to him. Had Peter gone back in the house, closed the door, you know, would he still be alive today? Just makes you wonder. It was just a sad set of circumstances that cost somebody their life.
Mix old family hatreds, loss of control of your emotions, and alcohol, and it often results in violent death. That's a terribly sad thing in the case of Peter Martinez.
Coming up, an unhinged madman threatens the safety of an entire church congregation.
You all will die today.
This is St. Mary's Cathedral. How could this have happened in here?
In January of 1996, a church service was going on. It was Sunday morning, downtown.
How are you?
Near the end of the first service, an usher, Ron Meredith, is passing the collection plate, like they do every Sunday. But a man is sitting in the back and just seemed a little out of it.
These people don't know what the hell they're doing.
Give it to me.
Excuse me, sir, that's not yours.
Give it to me, damn it. Give me that.
There was a lot of confusion.
Sir, back off.
Ron is able to grab it, and the deranged man told everybody,
I am the Lord Jesus Christ. You all will die today.
that made people very, very nervous.
Honey, call the police.
Later that morning, Lieutenant Joe Kenda is on his way into work.
Dispatch to X-ray 1.
The radio cracks and it said 1 X-ray 1. My call sign.
Go for X-ray 1.
Report of a shooting on Bijou Street. Redirect immediately.
Copy that. I'm on the way.
Ooh. On a Sunday morning when this town is either in church or still asleep? Pretty unusual. I arrived at the address before I realized it's the St. Mary's Church. It's a huge church and beautiful building. Been there for many, many years. My parents got married there in 1938.
Good morning, Lieutenant.
Morning. So what in the world's going on here?
Come inside, take a look.
So I walk in that church, as I had done many times. I'm directed to the men's room.
Whoa.
This is St. Mary's Cathedral. How could this have happened in here?
Less than an hour before Lieutenant Kenda arrived on scene, chaos was just beginning to unfold at St. Mary's.
Hello, 911?
911, what's your emergency?
A man just tried to steal from our church, and then he threatened to kill us. And I'm afraid he's going to try to come back.
We'll send units immediately.
Okay, thank you.
CSPD officers immediately respond, including patrolman Robert Benjamin.
In January of '96, I was in the patrol division.
Who here put in the call? Yeah, right here, we did. Is the suspect still inside? No, he fled. Came in, tried to take our collection plate, and threatened everybody. Where's the rest of the congregation? They're inside. Okay, can you describe this guy? Well, he's a pretty big guy.
Mr. Meredith told me he was kind of a stocky build, about 180 pounds.
As Ron is talking to the police, something interesting happened.
Yeah, I think I know this guy. His name's Deersmith. Richard Deersmith.
You sure about that?
Yeah, things happen pretty quickly in there, but I'm pretty sure it's him.
So now they're just looking for a description. They're looking for Richard Deersmith.
Give me a moment, please. Gulf 85 to dispatch. Can I get an APB and a white male? 6'2", 180 pounds, name Richard Deersmith.
When officers call in the suspect's name,
Patrol, did you say Deersmith?
it immediately raises red flags.
That's right.
You have a pen handy?
So they find out that Mr. Deersmith has a rather extensive criminal record.
So apparently our suspect has been arrested 17 times in 3 different states. 2 of those were for assaulting an officer.
So you take that in sum, and this not only is a disturbed person, but he has an inherent violence about him. And he's physically capable of carrying it out.
We have his name and description out there. We're looking for him. You call us if anything else happens.
Thank you so much.
The police leave the scene and start looking for the suspect in the neighborhood.
He resides in the area. Witnesses in his neighborhood report they saw Deersmith leave his house carrying his large knife, which they say is routine for him. He's always ranting out loud and talking to himself or to invisible people, and they are very frightened of him. He's obviously deeply disturbed.
While officers are busy canvassing the area, the congregation picks up where it left off.
A reading from the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthian brothers and sisters. Strive eagerly for the greatest spiritual gifts. Love is patient.
At that time,
love is kind.
Richard Deersmith returns to the church, and this time,
I know the sound of God.
He's got a knife in a sheath on his belt.
And if I have the gift of prophecy, I comprehend mysteries.
Deersmith did something kind of interesting and maybe unexpected. That he went straight to the bathroom. The people who really deserve a lot of credit, the quick-thinking ushers.
We need to get the police back out here.
Hey! I said get me out of this room!
Within moments, Officer Benjamin and company are back on the scene.
God will punish you for this!
He's been going crazy in there.
Hey! Hey!
Does he have any weapons on him? Yeah, he's got a knife.
We're not going to this room!
Lots of thoughts going through my head of knowing we have a combative suspect in front of us.
Let's get out of here.
It was not the first time that he had been involved in potential violence towards police.
The three officers go to the door,
Somebody get me out of here!
unlock the door.
Hands up, Richard! Put your hands up, Richard. Hands up! Don't do that, Richard.
The ushers hear somebody say, "Don't do it, buddy, don't do it."
The ushers heard a gunshot, and they thought, God, what is going on in there?
That's when the officers come out. And on their radio,
We need a medical down at the church right now.
a shooting officer involved. As I walk in, I see Richard Deersmith lying dead on the floor with a single gunshot wound in the upper left chest. And you stand there for a moment in that doorway and you look in this men's room and you think, why would that happen? We need to find that out.
Shortly after Kenda examines the crime scene, an investigator from the district attorney's office arrives to assist.
On any officer-involved shooting, the district attorney's office is called immediately. And there's definitely still a lot to figure out.
Okay. Well, I'm going to need to talk to everybody involved.
Of course.
The district attorney's office conduct all police officer-involved shootings independently of the police department. They are investigating why is it necessary for the police to use great force to effect his arrest.
So we teamed all of our investigators and detectives up together and started interviewing all the potential witnesses.
The eyewitness interviews help investigators piece together exactly what happened when Deersmith returned to the church.
When the ushers at the church saw Deersmith come back
I know the sound of God or a flashing symbol.
with a knife,
And if I have the gift of prophecy,
they were scared. As they had the opportunity to lock him in the bathroom,
Hey! God will punish you for this! Hey! Let me out!
they found the miracle they were praying for.
When Officer Benjamin responded for the second time,
Oh, God!
he knew the suspect had a history of assaulting police.
I was worried about the safety of the parishioners that were in the church.
Somebody get me
He's
out
been
of
in
here!
there going crazy. He's got a knife.
let's go this way.
At the time, all three officers had their hands on their guns. They were ready for anything. They knew he was armed at this point.
Somebody get me out of here!
Please, hands up! Hands up, Richard! Put your hands up, Richard.
Deersmith has the knife. It's a 10-inch blade Bowie knife. Very large knife.
Turn around, Richard. Turn around, walk backward toward me. Turn around.
He's not complying. He's just kind of staring right through us.
Turn around, Richard. Richard, turn around and slowly walk back toward me. Good. Keep your hands visible. Okay, back up toward me. Very good. Hands up. Keep your hands up where I can see them. Nice and slow. Good. Good. Hands up. Do not put that hand down. Do not touch that knife, Richard.
There's something called a continuum of force, and this is how police officers are trained. You confront someone, you announce to them that they're under arrest. If they physically resist you, you are authorized by law to use whatever force is necessary to overcome that resistance.
Don't do that, Richard. Do not touch that knife. Stop!
I am the Lord Jesus Christ!
These people don't know what the hell they're doing.
Oh, God. Lord, let me out!
Richard, do not touch that knife! Don't do it, Richard! Richard, no! Richard, stop!
He reached for the knife. At that particular point, I knew I had no other option.
It's a very difficult thing to take a human life. It is. Policemen are trained. Officer Benjamin followed his training to the T. He handled that perfectly under the worst possible circumstances, but it is a devastating emotional effect on the officer.
It wasn't until after everything had calmed down that I started to think about what had transpired. You know, just playing over and over in your head, and you start to sometimes second guess yourself, well, what if I'd have done this different?
In this particular case, the ruling from the district attorney was that the police officer was justified in using deadly force against Mr. Deersmith.
No charges were filed, and the matter was closed. And Mr. Deersmith was left to a higher court.
You never forget it. Quite frankly, it's tough to sleep. You know, it just plays continually in your head. And you eventually come to the conclusion that you had to do what you had to do, and it was necessary, and, you know, you just move on from that, but you never forget.
I was very fortunate in all of my years as a policeman, even though I displayed my weapon probably 20,000 times. I never pulled a trigger, never once. We're in the business of saving people, not killing them. Officers try anything to avoid it, and they suffer sometimes for the rest of their days if they're called upon to do it.
The call came in just after sunrise, when the heat hadn't yet settled and the air still felt thin enough to breathe, when the streets of this quiet Florida town were empty except for sprinklers ticking across perfect lawns and the distant hum of traffic that never quite touched this neighborhood. And what the dispatcher heard on the other end was not screaming, not panic, but something colder than that, a voice flattened by shock, saying there was a door open that should not be open, a house. Too quiet, a morning that had arrived wrong. And by the time the first patrol car rolled in, lights off, engine idling, it was already clear that whatever had happened here had not ended with the night. Inside the house, nothing was overturned, nothing shattered, no sign of struggle that shouted for attention, just a stillness so complete it felt staged, like a room prepared for photographs, sunlight falling through half-drawn blinds onto a kitchen table where a mug sat untouched, coffee cold, a calendar on the wall still flipped to the wrong day, and upstairs, behind a closed bedroom door, the reason for the call waited in silence, the kind of silence that sinks into the walls and never really leaves. She had lived here most of her life, known by everyone, waved to at grocery stores, recognized at church, a woman with routines so fixed that neighbors could tell time by them, morning walks, afternoon calls, porch lights turned off at exactly 10, and now she was gone, not missing in the way people sometimes drift away, not absent by choice, but erased from her own space, leaving behind a house that looked paused mid-breath, a life interrupted without warning, without explanation, without a single clear answer. Word moved fast, faster than the police tape could go up, faster than the official statements that would come later, whispered conversations sliding from driveway to driveway, from checkout lines to phone calls made in hushed voices, because this was the kind of town where nothing like this was supposed to happen, where crimes belonged on the evening news from somewhere else, somewhere distant, somewhere anonymous, not here, not to someone everyone knew, not inside a home that had always felt safe. Investigators walked the room slowly, methodically, shoes covered, gloves snapping on, eyes trained to look past the normal, past the comfortable, searching for disruption in a place designed to hide it. And what unsettled them most was not what they found, but what they didn't. No forced entry, no broken locks, no obvious theft, the doors intact, the windows secure, as if whoever came here had been invited, or at least expected, as if danger had arrived wearing a familiar face. The timeline was thin, stretched across a narrow window between a neighbor's late-night television and a delivery truck passing just after dawn. Hours where anything could have happened and no one could say for certain when the house had gone quiet. And as officers moved from room to room, photographing, bagging, documenting, the weight of that uncertainty settled in, heavy and unresolved, the kind that lingers long after the last clipboard is put away. Her car was still in the driveway. Her purse sat where she always left it. Her keys were on the hook by the door. Everything suggested she had never planned to go anywhere, never expected the night to end the way it did, and that detail alone sent a chill through the investigation, because it pointed inward, not outward, away from strangers and toward the intimate circle of people who knew her life well enough to step into it unnoticed. Detectives began with the usual questions, the ones asked 1,000 times before in 1,000 different cases. Who last saw her, who spoke to her, who had reason to come by unannounced? And the answers came easily at first: neighbors, co-workers, relatives, friends, all cooperative, all stunned, all certain they could never imagine such a thing happening here, their words blending together into a chorus of disbelief that did nothing to clarify what had actually taken place. Then there were the names that surfaced more quietly, offered with hesitation, the people who didn't just pass through her life, but moved within it. Family, friends, longtime acquaintances, those who had keys, who knew the routines, who wouldn't raise suspicion by showing up late or early. And among them, one name appeared again and again, not loudly, not accusatorily, but persistently, like a note that refuses to fade. He had been around for years, trusted, familiar, someone who helped with errands, fixed things around the house, shared meals, the kind of presence that blends into the background until it becomes invisible. And when detectives asked about him, the responses were carefully neutral, no outright accusations, no clear red flags, just pauses, subtle shifts in tone, the unspoken awareness that familiarity can sometimes be the most effective disguise. Still, there was nothing solid, nothing that could be held up to a judge or a jury, no physical evidence tying anyone directly to the scene, no witnesses placing a suspect at the house during the critical hours, and as the days passed, the urgency that had filled the first press conferences began to thin, replaced by cautious language and appeals for information that yielded little more than speculation. The media descended briefly, cameras lining the street, microphones angled toward grieving relatives, headlines flashing phrases like mysterious disappearance and community in shock, before attention drifted elsewhere, as it always does, leaving behind a family suspended in unanswered questions and a town quietly recalibrating its sense of safety. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Leads dried up. Tips contradicted each other. Files grew thicker without growing clearer, and eventually the case earned a new label, one that sounded almost clinical but carried enormous weight: a cold case, a file moved from active desks to storage, not closed, not solved, just waiting, frozen in time. But even as official momentum slowed, the absence remained loud. An empty chair at gatherings. A house that stayed dark longer than it should have. Anniversaries marked not by closure but by renewed frustration. And somewhere beneath the surface of this town, beneath the routines and the reassurances, the knowledge persisted that someone knew more than they were saying, that the truth was not gone, merely buried. Years later, detectives would return to this case with fresh eyes and new tools, but for now, in 1992, all they had were unanswered questions, a community struggling to reconcile trust with fear, and a silence that felt deliberate, heavy, and deeply unsettling. The kind of silence that suggests not an ending, but a story waiting to resurface, no matter how long it takes. By the second week, the house no longer felt like a crime scene to the people who lived around it, just a quiet structure sealed behind tape and time, but to investigators it had begun to feel heavier, as if the walls themselves were withholding something, every room revisited, every photograph re-examined, every measurement checked again against the same conclusion that refused to change, that whoever did this had known exactly how to move through this space without leaving chaos behind, without triggering alarms, without drawing attention, and that level of confidence was impossible to ignore. Detectives started reconstructing her final days in minute detail, mapping conversations, tracing phone records, replaying ordinary moments until they began to look suspicious under repetition. A grocery receipt here, a voicemail there, small fragments of routine now treated like potential clues, because when violence hides inside normalcy, normalcy becomes the only place left to search. She had made her usual calls, spoken to her sister, confirmed plans that would never happen, mentioned nothing out of the ordinary, no fear, no concern, no hint that she sensed danger closing in, and that absence of warning only deepened the mystery. The night itself remained stubbornly opaque, no neighbors reporting screams, no unusual vehicles noticed, no dogs barking long enough to raise alarm, just a quiet stretch of hours swallowed by darkness and humidity, and investigators found themselves relying on probability rather than proof, asking not what they could show, but what made sense, and sense kept circling back to access, to familiarity, to someone who didn't need to break in because they already belonged. When they began canvassing more aggressively, pushing past polite questions into uncomfortable territory, they discovered subtle fractures beneath the town's calm exterior, old disagreements, unspoken resentments, financial complications whispered about but never documented, and relationships that appeared benign on the surface but carried long, complicated histories underneath, histories that had never been examined because there had never been a reason to doubt them. The family friend's name surfaced again during these conversations, this time paired with small, almost dismissible observations. He had been seen nearby later than usual. He had mentioned stopping by that week. He had access to tools, to keys, to trust, none of it criminal on its own, none of it strong enough to stand alone. But together they formed a shape investigators could not unsee, a shadow that fit too neatly into the gaps left by the evidence. When questioned, he was calm, cooperative, unflustered, answering every inquiry without hesitation, his timeline tidy, his demeanor relaxed, the kind of composure that can either signal innocence or something far more calculated. And as detectives pressed him, probing for inconsistencies, they found none they could immediately exploit, no obvious contradictions, no visible cracks, just a man who knew exactly how to present himself when being watched. Still, instincts matter in investigations, especially when facts refuse to line up, and several officers would later admit there was something about the interviews that lingered with them. Not a single statement, not a specific lie, but the overall smoothness of it, the way his answers anticipated questions before they were fully asked, the way he seemed prepared for scrutiny in a town that had never expected to face it. As days stretched into weeks, pressure mounted from all sides, the family demanding progress, the community demanding reassurance, superiors demanding results, and detectives responded by widening the net, pulling in specialists, revisiting forensic samples with the best technology available at the time, only to be met again and again with inconclusive results, partial profiles, degraded materials, evidence that suggested violence without identifying a perpetrator. The lack of resolution began to take its toll on the investigation and on the people conducting it, overtime hours blending together, leads pursued until they collapsed under their own weight. The same questions asked in different ways, hoping for a different answer, and gradually, reluctantly, the case began to slow, resources reallocated, attention diverted, not because anyone believed the truth didn't matter, but because there was nothing left to push against. Outside the station, the town adapted in quieter ways, routines altered, doors locked earlier, neighbors watching neighbors with a new, cautious curiosity, conversations trailing off when certain names were mentioned, because suspicion, once introduced, does not stay neatly contained. It leaks, spreading through relationships, eroding trust, reshaping how people see each other even when nothing is ever said out loud. Years passed, and with them came new officers who learned the case not as a lived experience but as a file, a thick folder of reports and photographs documenting a crime that had happened before some of them joined the force. And while fresh eyes can sometimes spot what veterans miss, they can also struggle to feel the urgency that once drove every decision, the emotional weight diluted by time and distance. The house was eventually sold, the evidence boxes moved deeper into storage, and the case earned its permanent designation, cold case, a phrase that sounds static but in reality describes a state of suspended motion. a crime neither alive nor dead, waiting for something external to disrupt its stillness, a new witness, a confession, a technological breakthrough, anything capable of reintroducing momentum where none remained. For the family friend, life continued with little visible disruption, his name fading from conversation as years dulled the edges of suspicion, his presence once again blending into the background of a town eager to move on, and that, perhaps more than anything, underscored the tragedy of unresolved cases. Not just that justice is delayed, but that ordinary days continue for those who may not deserve them. Yet beneath the surface, the file never truly slept, revisited periodically by detectives unwilling to let it go entirely, each time technology advanced, each time policies shifted, each time another cold case somewhere else was cracked open by a detail once thought insignificant. And with every revisit came the same quiet question, whether the answer had been there all along, overlooked not because it was invisible, but because it was too familiar to question. By the late 1990s, forensic science had begun to change the landscape of criminal investigation, DNA analysis growing more precise, databases expanding, connections becoming possible that once seemed unthinkable. And although this case had little usable biological material by modern standards, what remained was preserved carefully, catalogued, waiting for a moment when, inconclusive, might finally become something else. The emotional weight, meanwhile, never lifted for those closest to the victim. Anniversaries marked not by remembrance alone but by renewed appeals for information. Their grief compounded by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, knew exactly what had happened inside that quiet house, and had chosen silence over truth year after year. As the decade closed, the case stood exactly where it had begun, defined not by what was known but by what was missing. A sequence of events reduced to speculation, a suspect impossible to charge, a community forced to accept ambiguity as a permanent condition, and though no one could yet articulate it, the foundation for a future reckoning was already being laid, slowly, invisibly, in evidence lockers and databases, in memories that refused to fade, in a cold case that was not finished with. This town, no matter how much time passed. By the time the case slipped fully into the background, it had stopped being talked about openly, not because it was forgotten, but because it had become uncomfortable, a subject that carried too many unanswered questions, too many half-formed suspicions, and in a town that relied on familiarity as its social glue, discomfort was easier to avoid than confront. The file sat in storage, but the story lived on in fragments, in lowered voices, in glances that lingered a second too long when certain people crossed the room. For the detectives who had worked it from the beginning, the absence of resolution never settled properly. It followed them through other cases, surfaced during late-night conversations in squad rooms, returned whenever a new cold case somewhere else cracked open unexpectedly. They knew this one had never truly gone cold. It had simply run out of tools. And for years, that was the quiet truth no one wanted to say aloud. The victim's routines remained etched in memory for those who had known her well, details that once seemed trivial now replayed endlessly. The way she trusted easily, the way she never locked the door during the day, the way she believed that long-standing relationships were proof enough of safety. That trust became the lens through which everything else was viewed, because it explained how violence could enter her life without force, how a crime scene could look untouched while something irreversible had occurred inside it. As time passed, rumors hardened into assumptions, assumptions into unspoken consensus, and while no one openly accused anyone, the town quietly rearranged its social orbit. Invitations changed. Distance grew. People learned who to avoid without ever articulating why. Suspicion did not need evidence to survive. It only needed proximity to fear. The family friend remained a presence, but a subtly altered one. He was still around, still familiar, still polite, yet something about him now drew quieter attention. His movements noted more carefully, his words replayed after conversations ended. He never addressed the case unless asked, and even then, his responses were brief, neutral, practiced, as if he understood that the safest place to stand was just outside the spotlight, close enough to appear cooperative, far enough to avoid focus. Detectives revisited him periodically over the years, each time under the guise of new information, a new angle, a routine check-in. Each time he complied. Each time nothing stuck. No confession. No contradiction. No evidence strong enough to resurrect a prosecution. And slowly, the visits became less frequent, not because interest waned, but because there was nowhere left to apply pressure. Inside the department, the case took on a different life. It became a reference point, an example used during training, a reminder of how crimes committed without witnesses or chaos can stall indefinitely, how trust can be weaponized, how familiarity can erase the very signs investigators rely on to build certainty. Younger officers studied the photographs without knowing the emotional weight attached to them, learning the mechanics without inheriting the frustration. Technology advanced quietly at first, then rapidly. DNA databases expanded. Cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s began to resurface in headlines, solved by techniques that hadn't existed when the crimes were committed. Each success reignited hope, not just for families, but for investigators who understood exactly what those breakthroughs represented. Time collapsing in on itself, answers emerging from evidence once deemed useless. In this case, the biological material was limited, degraded by age and environment, but it was not gone. It had been preserved carefully, not because anyone was confident it would one day speak, but because giving up entirely felt like an admission of defeat. And when new testing methods became available, the evidence was pulled once more, re-examined with a mix of skepticism and cautious anticipation. Results came back incomplete, partial, frustratingly ambiguous. Enough to suggest a path forward, not enough to confirm it. Profiles that could not yet be matched. Data points waiting for something external to align. The case hovered in that space between possibility and reality, close enough to feel progress, distant enough to deny closure. Outside the lab, life moved forward relentlessly. New families moved into the neighborhood. Children grew up unaware of the story tied to certain houses and names. The victim's absence became historical rather than immediate. Her memory preserved in photographs and anniversaries rather than daily routines. Yet for those who remembered, the lack of justice remained as sharp as ever, an open wound disguised as nostalgia. Then, years later, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. A small update in a national database. A policy change that allowed broader comparisons. A technological improvement that refined partial profiles into something more actionable. These changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, reshaping old cases without ceremony. When the file was reopened in earnest, it was not with the urgency of 1992, but with the patience of experience. Detectives approached it differently now, less reliant on intuition, more attuned to patterns, timelines, and long-term behavior. They reviewed interviews with fresh eyes, not looking for lies, but for consistency over decades, for statements that had aged poorly under repetition. The family friends' interviews stood out immediately, not because they contradicted themselves, but because they didn't. His account had remained remarkably stable across years and circumstances, a level of consistency that can sometimes signal truth, but can also indicate rehearsal. Investigators compared his statements against emerging data, noting where certainty appeared in places memory should have blurred, where confidence replaced approximation. Financial records were re-examined. Travel histories reconstructed. Small anomalies surfaced, nothing overtly criminal, but enough to warrant deeper attention. A visit that hadn't been mentioned. A purchase that aligned too closely with the timeline. Details once dismissed as irrelevant now carried weight under new scrutiny. Still, progress was slow. For every potential lead, there were 3 dead ends. For every promising development, a limitation. The case advanced inches at a time, propelled by persistence rather than momentum. And yet, for the first time in decades, it was undeniably moving forward. The emotional impact of this renewed activity rippled quietly through the community. Old names resurfaced. Old suspicions stirred. People who had long believed the case would remain unsolved felt a cautious unease. Not hope exactly, but the awareness that the past might not be as settled as it appeared. For the family friend, the change was subtle but noticeable. He became more guarded, less available, still cooperative, still polite, but no longer relaxed. Investigators sensed it immediately, the shift in tone, the slight hesitation where none had existed before, the careful phrasing that suggested an awareness of increased scrutiny. Yet nothing outwardly dramatic occurred. No arrest, no public announcement, just a case inching back toward relevance, gathering pressure in silence. And as the years pressed on, the distance between the crime and the present day began to feel less like protection and more like exposure, because time, once an ally, was slowly becoming a liability. The truth, long buried beneath familiarity and fear, had not disappeared. It had waited, and now, with technology catching up to silence, with memories no longer as reliable as they once were, the cold case was beginning to warm, not enough yet to burn, but enough to remind everyone involved that unresolved stories do not fade quietly. They linger, they watch, and eventually they demand to be heard. When the case officially reopened, it did so without ceremony. No press release, no renewed appeals to the public, just a quiet shift inside the department. A file pulled from long-term storage and placed back onto a working desk, its edges worn soft from age, its contents familiar and yet suddenly alive again. This time, the goal was not to relive 1992, but to interrogate it, to question assumptions that had gone unchallenged for decades, to ask not what investigators believed then, but what the evidence could support now. The first step was detachment. Names were stripped of context. Relationships were reduced to timelines. Emotional weight was set aside in favor of structure. Detectives approached the case as if it belonged to another town, another department, another era, because familiarity had always been this case's greatest obstacle, and distance, even artificial distance, offered clarity. They began by reconstructing the final 48 hours with forensic precision, mapping movements minute by minute where possible, layering phone records, receipts, witness statements, and known routines into a single, dense timeline that left little room for interpretation. Where memory filled gaps in earlier investigations, data now stepped in, cold and indifferent, unwilling to accommodate sentiment. What emerged was not a revelation, but a refinement. The timeline confirmed what had long been suspected, that the window for the crime was narrow, that access was controlled, that spontaneity was unlikely. This was not an act of opportunity. It was deliberate, planned if not in detail, then in execution. And that realization reframed everything that followed. Focus narrowed. Individuals who could not be placed within the window were deprioritized. Alibis once accepted without question were re-examined under modern standards. Investigators scrutinized not just where people claimed to be, but how those claims were supported, by whom, and with what degree of independence. Familiar faces began to separate themselves from the pack, not by guilt, but by proximity. The family friend moved steadily toward the center of that focus. His access was undeniable, his presence in her life well documented, his familiarity with her routines unquestioned. None of this was new. What changed was how these facts were weighed. Instead of being neutral, they became explanatory. They answered questions that had never fit comfortably before. Why no forced entry? Why no defensive wounds? Why the scene looked undisturbed? Why there were no witnesses? Trust, once viewed as background noise, now read as a facilitating factor, the mechanism by which violence could occur without alerting the neighborhood or triggering resistance. The crime scene no longer looked empty. It looked controlled. Investigators compared this case to others solved in recent years, noting patterns in crimes committed by individuals within a victim's social circle. The similarities were unsettling. Minimal disruption, limited evidence, rapid disappearance of overt motive. These cases often stalled early, not because they lacked clues, but because the clues pointed inward, toward people no one wanted to suspect. Re-interviews began, not with confrontation, but with curiosity. Detectives reached out under the premise of closure, of ensuring nothing had been overlooked, of giving everyone a chance to clarify their memories. Many declined politely. Some agreed reluctantly. A few spoke freely, perhaps more freely than they would have years earlier, time loosening the grip of loyalty and fear. These conversations yielded subtle shifts. A detail remembered differently. A timeline adjusted slightly. An assumption questioned aloud for the first time. Individually, they meant little. Collectively, they began to reshape the narrative, revealing inconsistencies not in facts, but in perception, the way people had once described events versus how they now understood them. When investigators returned to the family friend, the tone was still measured, but the structure of the interviews changed. Questions were narrower, follow-ups more precise. Silence was allowed to stretch longer. They were no longer fishing, they were testing, and in those pauses, something new emerged. He remained composed, but the effort showed. Where once his answers flowed, they now arrived carefully, assembled piece by piece. Where certainty had been immediate, it now hesitated. Detectives noticed micro-adjustments, a shift in posture, a recalibration of language, the subtle signs of someone navigating terrain that no longer felt familiar. They asked about things that had never been raised before. Minor errands, casual visits, unremarkable moments once considered irrelevant. And it was there, in the small details, that cracks began to form. Not breaks, not admissions, just moments where explanations grew slightly too elaborate, where simple questions received complex answers. Outside the interview room, analysts compared these statements against the reconstructed timeline, noting overlaps that had not previously stood out. A visit that coincided too neatly with a gap. A task that conveniently placed him nearby during critical hours. Again, nothing definitive, but patterns were emerging, and patterns, once identified, have a way of demanding attention. The forensic side continued to advance in parallel. Partial DNA profiles were refined further, narrowed by improved techniques and larger databases. The pool of potential matches shrank incrementally, each reduction increasing both the case's clarity and its pressure. The data did not name a suspect yet, but it was beginning to exclude others, and exclusion in this context was progress. As the investigation gained quiet momentum, the emotional temperature rose, particularly among those who had lived with uncertainty for decades. The victim's family was notified of the renewed effort, their reactions a mix of guarded hope and deep exhaustion. They had learned not to trust promises. Progress would have to prove itself. In the community, whispers resurfaced. Old conversations replayed. People began to reassess their memories through a new lens, wondering whether moments once dismissed as coincidence had been something more. The town's collective memory, long dormant, stirred uneasily. For the family friend, the shift was no longer subtle. He became defensive without being hostile, cautious without refusing cooperation. Investigators sensed an internal recalculation, a recognition that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. Time, which had protected him for years, was beginning to work against him. Yet even now, no single piece of evidence could carry the case alone. What investigators had was convergence, timelines aligning, behavior patterns emerging, forensic possibilities narrowing. It was not a breakthrough. It was something slower and more dangerous for a suspect, a steady closing in. Pressure does not announce itself all at once. It accumulates quietly, invisibly, built from repetition, from attention that does not drift away, from questions that return with sharper edges each time they are asked. In this case, the pressure began to settle not just on the investigation, but on the people orbiting it, the ones who had grown accustomed to distance, to time acting as insulation, and now felt that insulation thinning. Detectives shifted strategy, no longer chasing the idea of a single revelatory clue, but instead assembling a structure strong enough to stand without one. They focused on behavior across decades, on how people adapt when they believe scrutiny has ended, and how they react when it returns unexpectedly. The goal was not confession, not yet, but exposure, the gradual narrowing of space in which a narrative could exist unchallenged. They reviewed the family friend's life in parallel with the case's dormancy, noting patterns that aligned uncomfortably well with the timeline of the crime, moves that followed moments of renewed attention, relationships that ended abruptly, periods of isolation coinciding with anniversaries. None of it criminal, all of it contextual. Together, it formed a psychological backdrop that investigators could not ignore. When they brought him in again, it was under routine pretense, framed as clarification, not accusation. The interview room was neutral, deliberately unremarkable, designed to keep defenses low. But the questions were different now. They weren't seeking information. They were testing memory. He was asked to recount the same events he had described years earlier, not to catch him in lies, but to observe how certainty eroded under repetition. Genuine memory blurs. Fabricated memory calcifies. Investigators listened closely, noting where details remained unnaturally sharp, where dates were recited with calendar precision, where emotional reactions seemed rehearsed rather than recalled. They asked him about the victim not as a case, but as a person, her habits, her moods, her vulnerabilities. He answered fluently, perhaps too fluently, offering insights that bordered on intimate, revealing an awareness that extended beyond casual friendship. It was the kind of familiarity that could only come from proximity, from time spent in unguarded moments. Outside the room, analysts flagged these responses, cross-referencing them with statements from others who had known her just as long, sometimes longer. The contrast was stark. Others spoke in approximations, in generalities. He spoke in specifics. Memory, in his case, did not fade, persisted. Meanwhile, the forensic picture continued to sharpen. Advances in DNA technology allowed technicians to extract new information from old samples, fragmentary profiles slowly resolving into something closer to identity. The lab results did not point directly at him, but they moved the investigation into a narrower corridor, one where coincidence became increasingly implausible. Investigators began building a circumstantial framework, not as a fallback but as a strategy. They understood that cold cases rarely end with dramatic revelations. They end with convergence, with multiple independent elements aligning just tightly enough to leave no reasonable alternative. This was that process unfolding in real time. They re-examined financial records again, this time with greater context. Transactions once dismissed as routine now appeared timed, clustered around key dates. Small amounts withdrawn. Purchases made and later returned. Nothing illegal. Everything curious. Patterns that suggested preparation followed by concealment. Witnesses were revisited, not for new facts, but for old ones reframed. A neighbor recalled seeing a familiar car earlier than remembered. A coworker mentioned a conversation that now felt odd in hindsight. A relative admitted they had withheld a suspicion years ago out of fear of being wrong. These were not revelations. They were admissions of doubt, long suppressed. The cumulative effect was undeniable. The case no longer felt abstract, felt close, and that closeness began to manifest in subtle ways, particularly in the family friend's demeanor outside formal interviews. Detectives observed him from a distance, noting changes in routine, increased vigilance, a tendency to look over his shoulder that hadn't been there before. People who believe they are forgotten do not behave this way. At the department, discussions shifted from if to how. How to present decades of evidence coherently. How to explain delay without undermining credibility. How to ensure that when action was finally taken, it would hold. Cold cases fail not because they lack truth, but because they fail to translate truth into proof. Legal consultation became more frequent. Prosecutors were briefed quietly, cautiously. They asked hard questions. They challenged assumptions. They demanded clarity where investigators had long lived with ambiguity. And slowly, reluctantly, they began to see what detectives saw, not certainty but sufficiency. The emotional weight returned as well. For investigators who had inherited the case, it was professional focus. For those who had lived it, it was something else entirely, a resurfacing of old frustration, old anger, old regret. They knew that whatever happened next would not erase the years lost to silence, but it might finally interrupt it. The victim's family sensed the shift before being formally informed. Phone calls became more frequent, updates more specific, language more careful. Hope returned cautiously, tempered by experience. They had learned to survive disappointment. Belief would come later. As the pressure intensified, the family friend made a decision that did not go unnoticed. He retained legal counsel, quietly, without explanation. It was his right, of course, but timing matters, and this decision arrived just as the investigation reached its most focused phase. To detectives, it felt less like prudence and more like preparation. Still, no arrest was made. No charges filed. The case remained, officially, unresolved. But beneath that surface designation, everything had changed. The cold case was no longer dormant. It was active, deliberate, moving toward an inflection point. Time, once his greatest ally, had turned. Memories faded. Evidence improved. Silence grew louder. And as the space for plausible denial continued to shrink, the question was no longer whether the truth would surface, but how much damage it would cause when it did. Inevitability does not arrive with sirens or headlines. It settles in quietly, felt first by the people closest to it, the investigators who realize the questions have stopped multiplying and started narrowing, the prosecutors who sense that the story, once fragmented, is beginning to hold its shape. In this case, inevitability took the form of alignment, evidence no longer drifting independently but bending toward the same conclusion. Not dramatically, not conclusively yet, but persistently. Detectives began operating with a new discipline. Every action was logged. Every interview recorded with forensic precision. The margin for error had vanished. This was no longer an exploratory phase. It was a construction phase, building something that would have to withstand not just scrutiny but attack. Cold cases do not get second chances. They return to the physical evidence again, not because they expected something new to appear, but because repetition reveals context. Fibers were reanalyzed, trace materials reclassified. Items once grouped together were separated, reconsidered as individual artifacts rather than pieces of a whole. This granular approach uncovered relationships that had been missed before, not new facts but new relevance. The partial DNA profile, long the case's most frustrating limitation, finally began to speak more clearly. Advances in probabilistic genotyping allowed analysts to extract value from fragments once deemed too incomplete to matter. The results did not deliver a name. They delivered a range, a narrowing field, a biological signature that excluded nearly everyone investigators had ever considered, leaving behind a small, uncomfortable remainder. The family friend was within that remainder. This did not mean guilt. It meant possibility. And possibility, in a case that had lived without it for decades, was explosive. Investigators proceeded carefully. No leaks. No confrontations. The integrity of the process mattered now more than speed. They understood that a misstep here could unravel everything, turning decades of patient work into a cautionary tale. So they slowed down even as the pressure to move faster mounted. They began examining his past statements through the lens of this new forensic context. Phrases that once seemed benign now carried different weight. Assertions that had felt harmless now appeared strategic. The timeline he had offered, consistent as it was, aligned too neatly with the forensic window, accounting for every hour except the one that mattered most. They noticed something else as well, a recurring tendency in his interviews to frame himself as peripheral, present but uninvolved, helpful but detached. It was a subtle posture, one designed to maintain proximity without accountability. In isolation, it meant nothing. In pattern, it suggested awareness. Surveillance, limited and lawful, documented further changes. His routines had tightened. Movements became predictable. Social interactions shrank. He spoke less, watched more. People who feel safe do not behave this way. People who feel exposed do. Prosecutors requested a comprehensive review, not just of evidence, but of narrative. They wanted to know if the story could be told cleanly, coherently, without relying on leaps of logic or emotional appeal. Cold case juries are skeptical by nature. They demand restraint. They punish overreach. The investigative team responded by stripping the case down to its essentials. Access, opportunity, behavior, forensics, time. No speculation, no embellishment, just facts arranged in sequence, each one reinforcing the next. The picture that emerged was stark in its simplicity. He had access when others did not. He had opportunity within a narrow window. His behavior before and after the crime deviated subtly but consistently from baseline. His statements, though stable, displayed an unnatural resistance to decay. And the forensic evidence, while not definitive on its own, aligned with no one else in the investigative universe. Still, one obstacle remained: motive. Not because investigators believed motive was required, but because juries expect it. They want to understand why. And in this case, why was buried beneath years of normalcy, beneath a relationship that outwardly appeared supportive, benign, even kind. So detectives dug deeper, into finances, into personal history, into moments of conflict long minimized or forgotten. They discovered tensions that had never reached the level of confrontation, but had simmered quietly, frustrations expressed obliquely, obligations resented but never refused. Control, they realized, did not need to be loud to be real. Witnesses were approached again, this time with more direct questions. Had she ever expressed discomfort? Had she ever mentioned feeling pressured? The answers were hesitant, incomplete, but suggestive. Yes, she had mentioned feeling watched. Yes, she had hinted at wanting more independence. Yes, she had once said she needed space. These statements did not prove anything, but they contextualized the relationship, reframing it not as equal friendship, but as proximity weighted unevenly, one person embedded more deeply in the other's life than was welcome. It was a dynamic that had gone unexamined because it wore the costume of trust. As this understanding took shape, the investigation reached a critical threshold. Probable cause was no longer theoretical. It was forming, carefully, deliberately, every element reviewed, challenged, defended, every weakness acknowledged and addressed. The decision to move forward was not unanimous at first. Some argued the evidence, while compelling, still carried risk. Others countered that waiting longer would not strengthen the case, only erode it. Evidence does not age gracefully. Memory fades. Witnesses disappear. Ultimately, consensus emerged. Not certainty, but readiness. The family was notified again, this time with language that carried weight. Words like significant development and next steps replaced the vague assurances of the past. Their reactions were restrained, protective. Hope, once burned, does not flare easily. For the family friend, the walls began to close in. He sensed it. His attorney requested meetings, asked questions, probed boundaries. Investigators listened carefully, answering precisely, revealing nothing unnecessary. Silence now was strategic. They invited him in one final time, presenting it as routine, an opportunity to clarify lingering discrepancies. He arrived composed, guarded, eyes scanning the room with quiet calculation. The interview unfolded slowly, methodically, revisiting familiar ground before pivoting subtly toward the new forensic realities. When confronted with the narrowing DNA range, his reaction was minimal, almost dismissive. He questioned methodology, expressed skepticism. The response was measured, but it lacked the confidence of earlier years. This was no longer hypothetical. It was personal. Detectives watched closely as he recalibrated, choosing words more carefully, avoiding absolutes, retreating from certainty. These were not the reactions of an innocent man blindsided by accusation. They were the reactions of someone adjusting to constraint. The interview ended without confrontation, without confession. He left the room legally unburdened, but visibly altered. The distance he had maintained for decades was gone. The investigation had crossed a line. In the days that followed, paperwork moved quietly through channels that had not been used for this case in over 30 years. Warrants were drafted, affidavits refined, evidence packaged for presentation. Each step deliberate, irreversible. The cold case had entered its final phase, not with spectacle, but with resolve. The question of whether the truth would surface had been answered. Now, the only uncertainty that remained was when, and what would be left in its wake when it finally did. The warrant was signed without ceremony. A single judge reviewing decades of silence compressed into carefully worded pages. Each sentence weighed, each assertion supported, the language restrained but unmistakable. Probable cause does not need drama. It needs coherence. And by the time the pen lifted from the paper, the case had crossed a threshold it could never return from. Execution was planned with precision. No late-night raids, no flashing lights, no unnecessary spectacle. This was not about surprise. It was about control. Detectives understood the psychology of long-delayed accountability. A suspect who has lived freely for decades does not expect disruption. Routine becomes armor. The plan was to dismantle that armor quietly. They chose a morning like any other, unremarkable, forgettable, the kind that blends into memory until it doesn't. Officers arrived calmly, knocking rather than forcing entry, voices measured, badges visible, names spoken clearly. When the door opened, the moment stretched, recognition flickering across his face not as shock, but as confirmation, the realization that the future he had been quietly anticipating had finally arrived. He did not resist. He did not argue. He listened, asked a single question, then nodded. The arrest unfolded with procedural efficiency, handcuffs applied, rights read, movements deliberate and unhurried. To neighbors watching from behind curtains, it looked surreal. An ordinary man escorted away without struggle, without protest, without the chaos they associated with guilt. News spread fast this time, faster than in 1992, faster than rumors, faster than disbelief could settle in. Headlines broke across screens and radios, using language few in the town had ever expected to read. Cold case arrest, family friend charged. Decades later, the words landed heavily, reshaping a narrative that had been static for most of a generation. Reactions were immediate and divided. Some expressed relief, long-delayed validation that their doubts had not been unfounded. Others pushed back, clinging to the version of the past that felt safer, insisting there must be a mistake, that familiarity could not coexist with violence, that the man they knew could not be the one responsible. Denial, investigators knew, was not a defense mechanism for the accused alone. It belonged to communities as well. At the station, the atmosphere was controlled but charged. Detectives moved with purpose, evidence secured, procedures followed exactly. There would be no shortcuts now, no assumptions. Everything done by the book, because decades of delay had already stacked the odds against them. The interrogation room was prepared, cameras tested, chairs placed deliberately, not across from each other in confrontation, but at a slight angle, signaling conversation rather than battle. When he was brought in, he appeared older than his years, not frail but worn, the cumulative weight of time etched into posture and expression. They began gently, not with accusations but with history. They spoke about the town, about changes, about how long it had been. This was not rapport building in the traditional sense. It was orientation, grounding him in the reality that the past he had outlived was now fully present again. He responded cautiously, politely, maintaining the same composed demeanor he had relied on for years. He acknowledged the arrest, denied involvement, expressed sadness, shock, disbelief. The words were familiar, rehearsed through decades of hypothetical anticipation. Investigators let him speak. Silence at this stage was more valuable than pressure. Then they shifted, not abruptly but decisively. They laid out the structure of the case, not every detail, but enough to establish scope, to demonstrate that this was not speculation, not a fishing expedition, but a constructed narrative supported by evidence, time, and persistence. They spoke of access, of opportunity, of behavior, of forensics. When they mentioned the DNA analysis, his attention sharpened. Not panic, focus. He asked questions, technical ones, clarifying ones. This was a man trying to understand the limits of what investigators knew, where the boundaries lay, what remained unsaid. Detectives answered carefully, revealing nothing beyond what was necessary to maintain credibility. They returned to the night itself, asked him to recount it once more. His voice remained steady, but his story adjusted slightly, not in substance, but in tone, less certainty, more approximation. Memory, once rigid, had begun to soften under pressure. Investigators noted it silently. They introduced inconsistencies, not as accusations, but as curiosities. Small discrepancies between his statements and others. Gaps in time. Overlaps that shouldn't exist. They asked him to explain, not to defend. He tried. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The room grew heavier. Hours passed. Breaks were offered. Water refilled. The process was unhurried. They were not seeking a confession. They were seeking reaction. And slowly, that reaction began to surface, not in words, but in demeanor, a tightening of shoulders, a shift in breathing, the subtle erosion of composure. At one point, he stopped speaking altogether. Silence settled. Investigators waited. This was not a tactic. It was respect for the moment. Silence can be a form of communication. In this case, it was saturated with calculation. When he spoke again, his words were cautious, defensive, invoking counsel without formally ending the interview, signaling awareness of risk without fully retreating. The conversation wound down naturally after that. He was escorted out, returned to holding, the opportunity for spontaneous admission having passed. Outside the room, detectives reviewed footage, statements, reactions. There had been no confession, no dramatic collapse, but there had been something else, confirmation. The responses aligned with their expectations. The behavior fit the profile. Nothing they had seen undermined the case. Everything reinforced it. The arrest triggered a cascade. Warrants executed for additional evidence. Old items re-examined under new authority. Digital records subpoenaed. The case expanded briefly, not outward, but inward, deepening rather than widening. Each step added density to the narrative. For the victim's family, the arrest was not closure. It was disruption. Grief resurfaced raw and immediate, layered now with anger, relief, and exhaustion. They had lived long enough with uncertainty that certainty felt unfamiliar, almost intrusive. Justice, when delayed, does not arrive cleanly. In the community, the arrest forced a reckoning. Conversations that had been avoided for years now demanded space. People revisited memories with uncomfortable clarity, replaying interactions, reconsidering trust. The town's identity shifted subtly, innocence replaced by awareness. For the man at the center of it all, the world had narrowed dramatically. Freedom, once assumed, was now conditional. Time, once a shield, had become evidence. The decades he believed had insulated him were now being used to contextualize his actions, to demonstrate not innocence, but endurance. The cold case had finally broken its silence, not with revelation, but with accountability in motion. The story was no longer about what might have happened. It was about what would happen next. The courtroom did not feel like a place for answers. It felt like a place for resistance, wood polished by years of routine, flags standing still, air heavy with expectation and doubt. Justice in this room would not be discovered. It would be argued. The first hearing drew more people than the town had gathered in years. Journalists filled the benches beside retirees and former neighbors, faces aging differently but reacting in the same stunned silence. The defendant sat beside his attorney, posture controlled, expression neutral. A man who had spent decades blending into familiarity, now reduced to a name on a docket. The prosecution moved carefully. They knew the risks. Decades-old cases invite skepticism. Memories fade. Evidence ages. Defense strategies thrive on time's erosion. Every step forward had to be deliberate, grounded, immune to theatrics. This was not a story they could oversell. It had to stand on restraint. They began not with the crime, but with context. The town, the routines, the trust. They painted a picture of normalcy so complete that its disruption would feel unnatural, because that was the truth of it. Violence here was not loud. It was quiet, intentional, hidden inside access. Defense counsel responded immediately, framing the case as an exercise in retroactive certainty, warning of the dangers of confirmation bias, of investigators reinterpreting old facts to fit a new narrative, of science evolving faster than justice. They reminded the court that suspicion is not proof, that proximity is not guilt, that time distorts truth as easily as it preserves it. The judge listened, carefully, patiently. This case would live or die on procedure as much as substance. When motions were filed to suppress certain evidence, the courtroom held its breath. The DNA analysis was challenged aggressively, its partial nature emphasized, its probabilistic language framed as guesswork rather than science. Experts were called, credentials examined, methods dissected. This was not a battle over facts, but over interpretation. The prosecution countered with clarity, explaining the technology without oversimplification, acknowledging limitations without surrendering validity. They did not claim the DNA was definitive. They claimed it was consistent, corroborative, one element among many. This power lay not in isolation, but in alignment. Witnesses began to take the stand. Not eyewitnesses, not informants, but people who had lived in proximity to the victim, whose testimony was not about what they saw, but about what they understood too late. Neighbors described routines. Relatives spoke of trust. Co-workers recalled comments that now felt heavier in hindsight. Defense counsel cross-examined methodically, highlighting uncertainty, drawing attention to phrases like, "I think," and "I remember," pressing witnesses to admit the fragility of decades-old recollection. The goal was not to discredit them entirely, but to thin their impact, to reduce emotional weight to evidentiary noise. Then came the investigators, past and present, those who had worked the case in 1992 and those who had reopened it years later. They spoke about evolution, about how the absence of answers was not due to neglect but limitation. They explained why access mattered, why familiarity was relevant, why patterns across time revealed more than isolated facts. The defense pressed them hard. Why now? Why this suspect? Why trust new interpretations over old conclusions? The answers were careful, because technology changed, because databases grew, because patterns became visible only in retrospect, because justice does not expire. Throughout it all, the defendant remained composed, eyes forward, hands folded. The image of control he had maintained for decades now rehearsed daily. But observers noted subtle changes. Tightening jaw, a gaze held a fraction too long. Small, human reactions impossible to erase entirely. The victim's family sat together, a quiet presence anchoring the room. Their grief was not dramatic. It did not need to be. It existed in stillness, in the way they avoided looking at the defendant, in the way they braced themselves each time a familiar detail was spoken aloud. As the trial progressed, the narrative sharpened, not into certainty, but into coherence. The jury was not being asked to believe in a perfect case. They were being asked to believe in a reasonable one. One where opportunity, access, behavior, and forensics intersected too precisely to dismiss. The defense offered alternative explanations. Unknown intruders, coincidence, investigative tunnel vision. They reminded the jury that absence of evidence is not evidence of guilt. But each alternative strained under scrutiny, requiring more assumptions than the prosecution's theory demanded. Expert testimony on behavioral analysis added another layer, carefully framed to avoid profiling, focusing instead on response patterns, on how individuals react under prolonged suspicion, on the psychological impact of living adjacent to a secret. This testimony did not accuse, it contextualized. As days turned into weeks, fatigue set in. Jurors grew quieter. Journalists stopped speculating and started listening. The courtroom's energy shifted from anticipation to gravity. This was no longer about whether the case was interesting. It was about whether it was true. Closing arguments approached with an air of restraint. The prosecution did not ask for emotion. They asked for attention. They laid out the timeline one last time. Access, opportunity, consistency, forensics, silence. They argued not that the defendant was the only possible answer, but that he was the only reasonable one. The defense responded by invoking doubt. Not a specific doubt, general doubt, the passage of time, the danger of hindsight, the temptation to assign guilt because uncertainty is uncomfortable. They reminded jurors that acquittal does not require an alternative story, only the absence of certainty. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly, conversations hushed, tension unresolved. This was the moment decades of investigation had led to, not a verdict, but a question posed to 12 strangers asked to weigh the past with imperfect tools. For the defendant, deliberation was the final unknown. Control, once absolute, was now surrendered to process. For the town, it was a reckoning long deferred. And for the cold case itself, it was the last test, whether truth, delayed and fragmented, could still stand when challenged openly. Deliberation does not feel like time passing. It feels like suspension. The jury room became a sealed pocket of silence where decades collapsed into binders and notes, where 12 people who had never known the victim were now tasked with deciding what her absence meant. Outside, the courthouse waited, every hallway charged with speculation, every whispered conversation circling the same question without daring to say it aloud. Hours stretched, then days. Each update from the clerk sent a ripple through the room. Reporters glancing up, family members stiffening, the defendant sitting motionless as if stillness itself might influence the outcome. There were no visible signs of panic, no outward cracks, but those closest to him noticed the change. The way control had shifted from habit to effort. The way calm now required concentration. Inside the jury room, discussion moved in slow, careful arcs. Not arguments, conversations. Jurors returned again and again to the same pillars: access, opportunity, behavior, forensics. They acknowledged the absence of a perfect answer, the lack of eyewitnesses, the incompleteness of the DNA profile. They also acknowledged the improbability of coincidence stacking itself so neatly over 30 years. Some jurors hesitated. The weight of time pressed on them. How much certainty was enough after decades of silence? How much doubt was reasonable when doubt itself had protected someone for so long? They reread transcripts, replayed testimony, re-examined photographs that refused to explain themselves. What troubled them most was not what was missing, but what endured: the consistency of access, the stability of behavior, the alignment of evidence that had grown tighter, not looser, with age. This was not a case eroded by time. It was a case clarified by it. When the note finally arrived that a verdict had been reached, the courtroom filled faster than it had at any point during the trial. People stood shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with anticipation and dread. The victim's family entered together, hands linked, expressions unreadable. The defendant followed, posture rigid, gaze fixed forward. The clerk read the verdict slowly, deliberately, each word landing with finality. Guilty. There was no outburst, no gasps, no collapse. The words settled into the room like gravity, heavy and inescapable. For a moment, no one moved. Then reality resumed its flow. The family exhaled. Some cried quietly. Others stared straight ahead, processing a conclusion that had taken longer to arrive than anyone expected. The defendant reacted almost imperceptibly. A tightening around the eyes, a slight shift in breathing. Decades of control did not vanish in an instant. They dissolved gradually, revealing something underneath. Not remorse, not anger, but resignation. The understanding that time finally had run out. Sentencing was scheduled for a later date, but the verdict itself altered everything. The town, once defined by uncertainty, now faced a different burden. The knowledge that violence had not come from outside, but from within, that trust had not been misplaced accidentally, but exploited deliberately. Media coverage intensified, not with speculation now, but with analysis. Commentators spoke of cold cases and persistence, of justice delayed but not denied. But those phrases rang hollow to the people who had lived through the delay. Justice, when late, does not restore. It recalibrates. In the days that followed, conversations shifted. People spoke more openly about what they had suspected, what they had dismissed, what they had chosen not to pursue. The verdict validated some memories and complicated others. Relief existed alongside guilt, the uncomfortable awareness that silence, even unintentional, can extend harm. For investigators, the verdict brought satisfaction without celebration. They understood better than anyone what it had cost, not just in time and resources, but in emotional toll. Cold cases leave residue. They cling. Closing one does not erase the others. The victim's family returned home to a quiet that felt different now, no longer filled with unanswered questions, but with echoes of a truth that could never fully heal. Closure was not a door that closed. It was a door that stopped swinging, finally fixed in place. The defendant was remanded into custody, the routines of freedom replaced by the structures of confinement. His life, once measured in decades of normalcy, was now measured in procedures and schedules. The familiarity he had relied on was gone, replaced by anonymity of a different kind. Yet even with a guilty verdict, the story did not end cleanly. Appeals were filed, arguments prepared, defense teams pivoted, shifting focus from innocence to process, from facts to fairness. The legal system does not stop at truth, tests it repeatedly. And beneath all of this, beneath verdicts and headlines and commentary, the cold case left behind a quieter legacy. It altered how the town understood itself. It changed how people evaluated trust. It reminded everyone that time does not erase responsibility. It only delays its arrival. The past, once buried, had surfaced intact enough to convict. But the cost of waiting had been real, paid in years of silence, in relationships strained by suspicion, in a life taken and a community left to wonder why. The verdict answered the question of who. It did not answer the question of how to live with the answer. After the verdict, silence became the loudest presence in the town. The courthouse emptied, cameras packed away, microphones lowered, but the case refused to leave. It lingered in grocery store aisles, in parking lots after church, in the pauses that followed casual greetings. People spoke more softly now, as if volume itself might reopen wounds. The truth was out, but truth, once exposed, does not neatly fold itself away. Sentencing day arrived weeks later, stripped of the tension that had defined the trial but heavy with inevitability. The courtroom felt smaller, less crowded. Those who attended did so deliberately, knowing exactly why they were there. This was no longer about determining what happened. It was about deciding how much a life stolen long ago would weigh in years and numbers. The prosecution spoke first. Not with anger, not with spectacle, but with restraint. They laid out the damage in plain terms. A young woman denied a future, a family frozen in grief, a community unknowingly sheltering the source of its own fear. They argued that time should not soften consequence, that endurance was not atonement, that living freely for decades was not punishment, but privilege. The defense followed, shifting tone as expected. They spoke of age, of health, of a man who had already lost everything he once knew. They asked the court to consider that the person standing before them was not the same man who committed the crime. It was a familiar argument, one that echoed through courtrooms everywhere, the idea that time transforms guilt into something smaller, something more manageable. The judge listened without visible reaction. Then came the victim impact statements. Her sister spoke first, voice steady until it wasn't. She described birthdays that felt incomplete, holidays rearranged around absence, the quiet calculations of grief that never stop. She did not ask for vengeance. She asked for acknowledgement, for the court to recognize that what had been taken could not be measured solely in years. Her parents followed, older now, slower but clear. They spoke of hope as a dangerous thing, of how each new lead over the decades had reopened wounds they never fully allowed to close. They spoke of learning to live without answers, and how that skill, once learned, could never be unlearned. The defendant declined to speak. That silence carried weight. Some interpreted it as dignity, others as avoidance. The court did not speculate. Silence, like time, is neutral. Meaning is assigned by those left to interpret it. The sentence was delivered without flourish. Decades in prison. No dramatic language. No attempt at moral summation. Just a legal conclusion, firm and final. The number itself drew quiet reactions, subtle nods, brief exhales. It was not enough to restore anything, but it was enough to define the remainder of a life. As deputies led the defendant away, there was no resistance, no backward glance. Whatever narrative he had maintained for 30 years had reached its endpoint. From here on, his story would be told by intake forms, by schedules, by walls that did not care who he had once been. Outside, reporters searched for reactions, for statements that could be condensed into headlines. Some family members spoke. Others walked past, unwilling to translate something this heavy into sound bites. Closure, they understood now, was not a moment. It was a process, uneven and ongoing. In the weeks that followed, the town attempted to move forward, but movement came in fits. Old friendships felt altered. Long memories resurfaced. People reconsidered moments they had dismissed, conversations they had cut short, instincts they had ignored. The case became a reference point, a quiet caution woven into daily life. For law enforcement, the cold case became a template. Files were reopened, evidence re-examined. The success of one resolution sparked renewed attention on others. Hope returned to offices that had learned to suppress it. Persistence, it turned out, was contagious. The victim's family began a different kind of work. Sorting belongings, reclaiming memories without the constant ache of uncertainty. They spoke openly now, not about theories, but about her as she had been, a person, not a case. In that shift, there was relief, fragile but real. And still, the story resisted a clean ending. Appeals moved quietly through the system. Legal arguments dissected procedure and precedent. The verdict held, but the process reminded everyone that justice is not a single event. It is a series of tests, some visible, others not. Years from now, the case would be summarized in documentaries, in articles, in brief paragraphs that captured facts but not atmosphere. They would say the cold case was solved. They would say justice prevailed. What they would not capture was the waiting, the long, corrosive patience required to live alongside unanswered questions. The way time stretches suffering instead of dulling it. The cold case was closed, but its shadow remained, not as fear, but as memory, a permanent reminder that the past does not disappear when ignored. It waits, quietly, faithfully, and when it returns, it demands to be acknowledged in full. The night after sentencing, the town slept differently. Not better, just differently. Streetlights hummed as they always had, but the darkness between them felt altered, thinner somehow, as if something long buried had finally shifted underground. Doors were locked out of habit, not fear. Windows reflected familiar rooms, yet carried the faint unease of recognition, of realizing that the danger had never been distant, never abstract, never someone else's problem. For decades, the cold case had been a ghost story people told themselves to explain the unexplainable. A stranger passing through. A wrong place, wrong time tragedy. A mystery without a face. That story was easier, safer. It allowed everyone to keep living without looking too closely at the people around them. Now that story was gone. In its place sat a quieter, more uncomfortable truth. The threat had eaten dinner at familiar tables, waved from driveways, shared laughter at community events. Evil had not announced itself. It had blended in. It had aged alongside everyone else. That realization did not fade with the headlines. In the following months, routines resumed, but trust did not fully return. Parents watched longer at bus stops. Conversations stalled when certain names came up. Longtime friendships carried a subtle strain, the unspoken question lingering behind polite smiles. How well do we really know anyone? The house where it happened was sold again. New owners repainted the walls, replaced the floors, tried to overwrite the past with fresh beginnings. But neighbors noticed the way visitors slowed when passing by, the way delivery drivers hesitated at the address, as if the numbers themselves carried weight. Some places absorb what happens inside them. No renovation can undo that. The victim's name began appearing differently in the local paper, no longer paired with the word missing, no longer framed by speculation. Instead, it surfaced in quieter contexts. Scholarship funds, memorial runs, a park bench with a small brass plaque that caught the sun in the late afternoon. These were not attempts to solve anything. They were attempts to remember. Her family learned how to live without the constant ache of uncertainty. But grief did not evaporate. It changed shape. It became steadier, less sharp, but deeper. A presence rather than a wound. They spoke of her more freely now, not because it hurt less, but because it no longer felt unfinished. Law enforcement moved on to the next file. Another box, another name, another date circled in red. The success of this case fueled resolve, but it also carried a warning. Every solved cold case proved two things at once: that justice could be delayed but not denied, and that it had taken far too long. Detectives who had retired returned briefly, standing in doorways, nodding at the files they once carried home in their heads. Younger investigators listened, absorbing the lesson passed down without ceremony. Never assume time will erase truth. It only hides it. As years passed, the defendant aged behind concrete walls. His story stopped evolving. No more speculation, no more theories, just a fixed point in the narrative, defined by a verdict and a number. He became what cold cases always turn suspects into eventually, not mysteries but footnotes. The focus shifted away from him where it had always belonged. And still questions remained. Not about guilt, that had been decided, but about moments lost, about choices that might have changed everything, about the thin line between familiarity and danger. These questions had no legal answers. They lived instead in conversations, in cautionary advice passed quietly between generations. This is the part no verdict can resolve. Because a cold case does not truly end when it is solved. It ends when the community understands what it has learned. That evil does not always come from outside. That time is not a cure. That silence protects no one. And that justice, when it finally arrives, does not restore what was taken. It only confirms what was true all along. The Florida 1992 cold case is closed on paper. But in memory it remains open. A reminder etched into the town's identity. A name no longer missing, but never forgotten. And a story that whispers its warning long after the microphones are turned off, long after the lights fade, long after the final sentence is read. Because some echoes do not fade. They wait. Time did not stop after the case was closed. It never does. It moved forward in small, ordinary ways. New children were born. Old buildings came down. Roads were widened. Signs replaced. Trees trimmed back as if the town itself were slowly trying to forget what it had once held inside. But forgetting was never really an option. Not after a truth like this surfaced. Not after a cold case rewrote the meaning of 30 quiet years. The story changed shape as it traveled. Outsiders heard it as a warning tale, something unsettling to read late at night, a headline that made people pause before scrolling on. Family friend charged decades later. A sentence that felt almost unreal, like fiction sharpened just enough to cut. But for those who lived there, the words landed differently. They carried faces, voices, familiar intersections and school hallways, and shared histories that could not be edited out. There was a moment, months after the trial, when the town gathered again. Not for court, not for media, for a vigil. No cameras, no speeches rehearsed for impact. Just people standing together in the humid Florida evening. Candles flickering as insects hummed in the dark. The air felt heavy the way it always had, but this time the weight was shared. Grief no longer sat alone inside individual homes. It stood openly in the street, acknowledged at last. Someone read the victim's name. Just once. No last name. No context. Just the name, spoken clearly, allowed to exist without explanation. And in that moment, something subtle shifted. The case was no longer a story about what happened to her. It became a story about who she had been. That distinction mattered. Years earlier, the cold case had turned her into a symbol, a mystery, a headline frozen in time. Now, slowly, she returned to being human in the collective memory. Someone who laughed, who argued, who had unfinished plans. Someone whose absence had shaped a town without anyone realizing it. The younger generation listened quietly. Many of them had been born after 1992. To them, the case had always been history, a rumor, something adults referenced without detail. Now they understood why certain rules had existed, why parents had been strict about curfews, why trust had been rationed carefully, even when no one said why. This was the inheritance of a cold case. Not fear exactly. Awareness. Teachers spoke differently about safety. Community leaders emphasized reporting concerns, no matter how small. Not because danger was everywhere, but because silence had once been. And silence, everyone now understood, was the one thing that had truly allowed the case to go cold. The legal system moved on as it always does. New trials, new defendants, new stories competing for attention. The Florida 1992 case became less visible in the headlines, replaced by fresher shocks, fresher outrage. But inside the town, it remained a reference point, a quiet benchmark against which other events were measured. Whenever someone said, "That could never happen here," no one nodded anymore. They had learned better. The victim's family marked time differently now. Anniversaries were no longer dates of disappearance, but dates of remembrance. They allowed themselves moments of joy without guilt, moments of laughter without apology. Not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer defined every breath. They visited the plaque in the park sometimes. Not every day, not ritualistically, just when they felt the need to remember without investigating, to grieve without questioning, to exist without waiting for the phone to ring with news that would never come again. And somewhere deep inside the town's collective consciousness, a final understanding settled in. Cold cases are not just about crimes. They are about communities, about how long people can live beside unanswered questions, about how easily familiarity can disguise danger, about how truth does not decay, no matter how many years are stacked on top of it. The Florida 1992 cold case did not end with an arrest. It ended with recognition. Recognition that justice delayed still leaves scars. Recognition that closure is not a door that slams shut, but a path that slowly opens. Recognition that memory, once reclaimed, has power. And that power, when carried forward, becomes a warning. Not shouted, not dramatized, just present. A quiet voice beneath everyday life, reminding those who listen that the past is never truly past, and that even the coldest cases are only waiting for someone brave enough to look again. Long after the last candle burned out, after the park emptied and the plaque cooled beneath the night air, the case settled into its final form, not as a headline, not as a courtroom record, but as a quiet truth woven into the town's daily rhythm. People noticed it in small ways. A pause before answering the door. A second look at a familiar face. The instinct to speak up when something felt off, even if it seemed inconvenient, even if it risked discomfort. These were not reactions driven by fear. They were habits shaped by memory. The cold case had taught the town a language it never wanted to learn. One spoken without words, carried in posture and silence. It was the understanding that danger rarely arrives loudly, that it often arrives smiling, that it survives on politeness and the benefit of the doubt. Years passed. New families moved in, drawn by sunshine and quiet streets. Realtors mentioned nothing beyond school districts and commute times. Officially, there was no reason to. The case existed in public records, but life does not run on footnotes. It runs on what people choose to pass down. And some things were passed down carefully. Parents taught their children to trust instincts without naming the lesson's origin. Teachers emphasized awareness without invoking history. The story became distilled, less about the crime itself and more about what it revealed. That listening matters, that doubt can be useful, that certainty is often the most dangerous illusion. The house changed hands again. Eventually, it stopped being pointed out. Not because it was forgotten, but because it no longer needed to be marked. The town had absorbed what it needed from that place. Memory does not require landmarks once it becomes internal. The victim's name continued to surface, gently, in a scholarship awarded each spring, in a brief mention at a charity event, in conversations that began with, "Do you remember when?" She was no longer frozen at the moment she disappeared. She aged in memory now, imagined with gray hair, imagined with children of her own, imagined in futures that never happened but were finally allowed to be pictured. This was not denial. It was an act of restoration. Cold cases steal that ability first, the ability to imagine beyond the moment of loss. Solving one does not give the future back, but it gives permission to look forward again. Some nights, the detectives who worked the case still thought about it. Not with frustration anymore, but with a kind of reverence. They remembered the smell of old paper, the hum of evidence rooms, the hours spent staring at nothing until something shifted. They remembered how close the truth had always been, how easily it had blended into the background. They carried that memory into every new case. A reminder that answers are rarely dramatic when they arrive. They are quiet, procedural, earned through patience most people never see. The movies get this wrong. Real justice moves slowly, and it asks for belief long before it offers proof. The defendant remained where the system placed him. Time, which had once protected him, now passed without significance. Days measured by counts and schedules, by walls that did not recognize the decades he had lived untouched by consequence. His name faded from conversation, his face from memory. That, too, was a form of justice, not erasure but irrelevance. Because the story was never meant to end with him. It ended with the understanding of what had been lost and what had been learned. Cold cases, when they break open, do not close neatly. They leave behind questions that no court can answer. They force communities to reckon not just with a crime, but with themselves, with the choices made, the warnings missed, the comfort found in explanations that felt safe but were wrong. This town did that reckoning quietly. No monuments, no slogans, just a shift in how people listened. And that shift endured. Years from now, someone would stumble across an old article, a yellowed clipping archived online. The headline still sharp. Florida 1992 cold case solved. Family friend charged decades later. They would read it with disbelief, with that familiar chill, then move on. What they would not see was everything that followed. The slow rebuilding of trust. The careful passing of lessons. The way a single solved mystery reshaped an entire place. Because the true ending of a cold case is never written. It is lived. Every day, in the choices people make when they decide to question, to notice, to speak. In the understanding that truth does not disappear when ignored. It waits, patient and intact, until someone is willing to face it. And in that waiting, it leaves echoes. Not loud, not constant. Just enough to remind those who hear them that the past is never gone, that justice can arrive late but still matter, and that some stories, once uncovered, continue long after the final word is spoken. Still, there is a moment that comes after every long reckoning, when the noise finally drops away and what remains is not relief, but clarity. That moment arrived quietly. No announcement marked it, no date circled on a calendar. It slipped into existence on an ordinary morning, when the town woke up and realized it was no longer waiting for anything. No updates, no calls, no breakthroughs. The case, which had once consumed decades of hope and frustration, no longer hovered over daily life like unfinished business. Waiting had ended. What replaced it was something heavier, but steadier. Knowing who had been lost, knowing who had been responsible. Knowing how easily the truth had been overlooked because it wore a familiar face. This knowledge did not demand constant attention. It didn't shout. It simply existed, settled into the foundation of the town like bedrock. Unseen but impossible to remove. The cold case had stripped away a certain innocence. Not the kind people talk about nostalgically, but the quiet assumption that terrible things announce themselves, that danger leaves obvious footprints, that monsters look like monsters. That assumption was gone now, replaced by a sharper awareness of how ordinary violence can appear, how patiently it can wait. People adjusted. They learned to live without the comfort of easy explanations. They accepted that certainty is rare, and that doubt, handled carefully, can be protective rather than paralyzing. Conversations grew more honest, less polite. When something felt wrong, it was said out loud. That, more than any sentence handed down in court, was the real change. The victim's memory continued to evolve. She was no longer bound to the narrative of how she died or disappeared. She was remembered in fragments of joy instead. Stories surfaced that had never felt safe to share before. Moments that had once seemed insignificant, now treasured because they proved she had lived fully, brightly, before being reduced to a case number. These memories did not erase the loss. They balanced it, and balance, after decades of imbalance, felt like progress. For the family, healing did not mean forgetting. It meant releasing the role the case had forced them to play. They were no longer witnesses, no longer caretakers of unanswered questions. They were simply a family again, shaped by grief but not defined by it. That distinction mattered more than anyone outside could understand. The justice system archived the file. Boxes labeled. Evidence logged. A case officially marked closed. To the system, this was the end. To the people who had lived alongside it, it was something else entirely. A transition from obsession to memory, from urgency to meaning. Cold cases teach this lesson better than any textbook ever could. That time does not heal by itself. That silence is not neutral. That familiarity can be the most effective disguise. And perhaps most importantly, that truth does not require urgency to survive. It requires patience. It requires someone eventually to look again and refuse to look away. The Florida 1992 cold case had waited decades for that moment. When it finally came, it did not arrive with fireworks or dramatic music. It arrived with paperwork, testimony, and the slow dismantling of a lie that had held for far too long. And once dismantled, it could never be rebuilt. The town carried forward, not lighter, but wiser. Wiser about what it means to pay attention. Wiser about the cost of assumptions. Wiser about the quiet responsibility shared by everyone who chooses comfort over curiosity. This wisdom did not dominate daily life. It lived beneath it, informing choices in subtle ways, shaping instincts that would never again be as naive as they once were. That was the final legacy of the cold case. Not fear, not even justice alone, but awareness. An awareness earned through decades of waiting, through loss endured without answers, through a truth that refused to disappear no matter how long it was buried. And in that awareness, the story finally found its place. Not as an open wound, not as an unresolved mystery, but as a chapter that had been read to the end, understood for what it was, and carried forward without denial. The case was over. The lesson remained.